You're not kind. You just learned that pleasing others was the only way not to be abandoned. Today, you'll understand why Machiavelli would call that kindness your most strategic prison. There's a terrifying truth about kindness that almost nobody is brave enough to confront. You've spent your life being good, always available, always understanding, always the one to smile when you wanted to scream. People call you kind, and it feels like praise, but something feels wrong, deeply wrong. Because you know you're not simply kind, you're quietly terrified. Terrified of rejection, terrified of losing approval, terrified that if you stopped smiling for just one moment, everyone you cared about would vanish. And somewhere along the way, your kindness stopped feeling like a choice. It started feeling like chains wrapped tightly around your soul. Machiavelli once wrote something chilling. It is far safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. At first glance, those words sound ruthless, almost cruel. But if you dare look deeper, if you stare into that cold mirror long enough, you begin to understand why you always end up exhausted, empty, unseen. You chose to be loved at all costs, at the expense of yourself. You turned kindness into a desperate shield, trying to protect yourself from abandonment. And in doing so, you locked yourself into a cell of emotional servitude, where every favor you give out becomes another brick in the wall, separating you from who you truly are. Machiavelli understood human nature in ways most prefer not to. He saw clearly that kindness without boundaries quickly becomes slavery. You think you're being gentle, generous, nurturing, but underneath, the motivation is raw fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear that you'll lose your place in someone else's life if you ever stood up and said no. You call it kindness, but in truth, it's a desperate survival strategy. Science confirms this hidden cruelty behind excessive kindness. A revealing study from the University of California, Berkeley, found that those who ranked high in agreeableness, the personality trait most often associated with kindness, were significantly more prone to emotional burnout, exhaustion, and manipulation in their relationships. Particularly those raised in environments where love and acceptance were conditional, given only when they behaved perfectly. Your kindness wasn't born from virtue. It was forced into you by the threat of abandonment. It became your only acceptable face, a mask you learned to wear with exhausting perfection. Carl Jung described this mask as the persona, the social facade you adopt to earn acceptance, sacrificing your true identity on the altar of pleasing others. Jung warned that the persona could suffocate the authentic self, slowly starving it until there was almost nothing left but compliance and invisibility. Your fear of rejection has fed this persona so thoroughly for so long that you struggle to separate it from who you really are. You've become so adept at pleasing others that you have forgotten how to please yourself. You've confused obedience with kindness, and now your obedience is suffocating you. But here's the powerful twist and the reason you can't stop being watching. You're beginning to realize something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Your emotional prison has an unlocked door. Machiavelli's words weren't meant to make you cruel. They were meant to wake you up, to remind you that kindness, when it is genuine, always includes the freedom to say no. And if you cannot say no, then your yes has no value. You've been giving yourself away freely, silently hoping someone will finally notice your worth. But the only person who can truly see your worth is you, and you've forgotten how to look. Today isn't about becoming harsh or cold. It's about becoming honest. It's about seeing kindness clearly, as a choice, not as a cage. Your fear of rejection created the prison, and your silence sealed the lock. But awareness is the key, and today, it sits in your hand. The question isn't whether you have the strength to use it, but whether you have the courage to realize you've been holding it all along. They told you kindness was a virtue, that being patient, selfless, and understanding would make you lovable, irreplaceable even. But what they never told you is that people stop respecting what never resists, and that the more you try to be good in a world that feeds on advantage, the more invisible you become. You don't realize it at first. It starts subtly. You say yes to things that exhaust you. You smile through moments that hurt. You stay quiet when your boundaries are violated, convincing yourself that it's just not worth the conflict. But deep down, something cracks. A slow erosion begins, the loss of your own reflection. You keep giving, they keep taking. And you call it love, loyalty, or emotional intelligence. But if you were honest with yourself, you'd admit that it's fear. A fear so deeply rooted disguises itself as compassion. You're not acting from clarity, you're negotiating for safety. You want to be needed, not because it empowers you, but because it gives you a reason not to be abandoned. Your kindness becomes your identity, but only because you don't believe you're worthy without it. And so, the prison builds itself, one silent sacrifice at a time. There's a moment, quiet, usually in the middle of the night, when this realization knocks on your skull like a ghost. You wonder why you're so tired, why people seem comfortable disappointing you, why you're the one who remembers birthdays, offers help, stays after everyone leaves, but when you're the one unraveling, silence answers. You think you're just unlucky, but it's not luck. It's a pattern designed to keep you submissive and mistaken for noble. Machiavelli didn't write about emotions, but he understood strategy. He knew that virtue, when unguarded, invites conquest. Mercy without power isn't seen as grace. It's seen as weakness. And when you lead your life with uncontrolled kindness, you become exactly that, a quiet target. You don't need to stop being kind, but you do need to understand the cost of kindness without a backbone. Because if your love doesn't include self-respect, it's not love. It's emotional self-harm in slow motion. That's why you feel so fragmented. Not because you're broken, but because you've given away so many pieces of yourself to maintain peace. And now there's barely anything left to protect. Carl Jung would say your persona, the version of you created to please, adapt, survive, has taken over. And the real you, buried, suppressed, muted. That's why no amount of helping others ever feels fulfilling anymore. Because what you need is not to be needed. What you need is to be free. And if this revelation hits something you've never been able to name, help me keep this message alive. Subscribe to the channel, like this video. That's the only way this kind of honesty survives in a world drowning in noise. They never taught you how dangerous it is to be needed. At first, it feels powerful, being the one people depend on. You become the fixer, the listener, the one who always knows what to do. They lean on you when they're weak, cry in your presence, ask for your time like it costs you nothing, and you give it, willingly. Because somewhere in the background of your childhood or your relationships, being useful became the only way you felt safe. If you weren't fixing something, you were afraid you might be forgotten. But what they don't tell you about being needed is that it becomes a drug, a subtle addiction to importance. You don't know who you are when no one is asking for anything. The silence feels threatening. The absence of someone else's crisis leaves you face to face with your own. And you don't know what to do with that. So you give more, you overextend. You abandon your own needs because someone else's brokenness feels more urgent. And deep down, you're hoping that all this sacrifice will eventually earn you something in return. Loyalty, love, permanence. But what you get is often the opposite. The more they depend on you, the less they respect your limits. Because you never showed them where those limits were. Jung warned us about this. He said that when the persona, your social mask, takes over, the self becomes a servant. You become what others need, not what you are. And the most dangerous part? You're applauded for it. They call you strong, caring, emotionally mature. But inside, you feel hollow. Every time someone praises your patience, it scratches the surface of a wound you don't talk about. The fear, that if you ever stopped being useful, no one would stay. You've confused devotion with disappearance, and now you can't tell the difference between love and obligation. Your yes no longer means anything because you've never used it to mean I choose. You've only used it to mean I'm scared you'll leave. And Machiavelli would call this out instantly, not because he disapproved of empathy, but because he understood the cost of giving power without strategy. You gave your emotional authority away. You offered your energy as tribute, and now you live in a castle where everyone is welcome, except you. Being needed is a beautiful thing when it comes from overflow. But when it comes from scarcity, it turns into quiet self-betrayal. You bend until you snap. You say yes until your soul forgets how to scream. And still, they want more. Because kindness without boundaries is a well they'll keep drawing from, until it's dry. This is not about becoming hard or cold. It's about becoming whole. You don't owe your energy to everyone who demands it. You don't need to solve what they refuse to face. You are not the glue holding broken people together. And if your value only exists in how much you serve, then what you have isn't a relationship. It's servitude. Let that sink in. Because the addiction to being needed is the perfect disguise for self-abandonment, and no one will ever rescue you from a prison you volunteered to build. They say power corrupts, but they never mention how often fear disguises itself as kindness. You've been taught that being good means being soft, agreeable, forgiving, that saying yes is noble, that keeping the peace is mature. But what happens when that moral code, carved into you since childhood, starts to rot your spine from the inside out? When your goodness becomes a performance and your peacekeeping a slow, daily self-erasure? There's a moment, maybe it already happened, when you realize you're not respected. You're tolerated, admired from a distance, but rarely protected. Because kindness without resistance doesn't inspire loyalty. It inspires expectation. And this is where Machiavelli's brutal clarity becomes your unexpected ally. He believed that mercy without control weakens a ruler, that virtue, when not backed by strategy, invites manipulation. It sounds harsh, but then again, so does your life lately. The exhaustion, the quiet resentment, the inability to say no without guilt eating you alive. You think you're being moral, but morality without boundaries isn't virtue. It's self-harm dressed in ethical language. It's you, bleeding slowly under the weight of a code you never chose, but were too afraid to break. You inherited your morality. You didn't forge it. And now it governs you like a law you never voted for. Every time you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own voice, that morality wins. And you lose another piece of your authority. You don't speak when you should. You apologize when you're right. You downplay your needs until you forget what they ever felt like. Because someone taught you that love means being small, quiet, easy to absorb. They taught you that anger is ugly, that no is cold, that choosing yourself is selfish. And you believed them. Not because it made sense, but because you were too young to survive without approval. Jung warned us about this inner fracture. He called it the splitting of the self. The moment when the authentic core is buried under a persona designed for survival. You became the good one, the calm one, the one who never disrupts. But every time you silence your truth in the name of harmony, that fracture widens. You start forgetting what real power feels like. And worse, you start fearing it. You mistake it for cruelty, because in your world, power was always the weapon that others used, never something you were allowed to own. But real power isn't domination. It's clarity. It's the ability to say, this is who I am. This is what I will allow. And I do not need to earn love through sacrifice. You've spent years following a morality that made you smaller, that stripped you of your edge, your fire, your ability to take up space. But now, that fire is returning, quietly, relentlessly, and it's demanding that you question everything they told you was right. Because morality that demands your silence is not morality. It's programming. And you're not here to follow rules that keep you invisible. You're here to remember that real kindness includes self-protection. That your peace is sacred, but only if it includes your voice. The people who truly love you will never require your self-abandonment as proof. Let that truth burn. Let it shatter the script you've been reciting for years. Because the morality you inherited was never made to protect you. It was made to control you. You've tried everything to feel seen. You've over-explained, over-given, overstayed in places where your silence was more useful to others than your truth. And yet, every time you hoped someone would finally recognize the weight you carry, they just smiled and called you strong. But you're not strong. You're surviving. There's a difference. Because strength implies choice. And most days, you don't feel like you have one. You've become the version of yourself that hurts the least amount of people. And in doing so, you became invisible, even to yourself. When you always say yes, your voice stops meaning anything. It dissolves into background noise. Predictable, manageable, easily ignored. And here's the twisted part. They like you like that. Predictable, nice, harmless. Because the moment you start saying no, the moment you reclaim your edge, your complexity, your right to discomfort, you become inconvenient. And for many, that's unacceptable. But why is your truth considered a threat? Why is your boundary read as betrayal? Machiavelli would tell you why. Because the world respects what asserts itself and uses what submits. He wasn't just talking about empires and politics. He was talking about human nature. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. And if you always absorb, adapt, and explain yourself, you become the path of least resistance. Not out of love, out of utility. That's not connection. That's quiet exploitation. Somewhere along the way, you were taught that saying no meant you were selfish, that having limits meant you lacked compassion. But that's the lie they tell people like you. People who crave peace so deeply, they'd rather disappear than disappoint. Jung would call this the shadow of the pleaser. The part of you that represses anger, represses frustration, represses your raw human needs in order to stay good. But that shadow doesn't go away. It festers. And over time, it becomes resentment so thick, it starts poisoning even the love you give freely. You start noticing it in small moments. You help someone, but feel drained instead of fulfilled. You agree to something, but secretly hope they cancel. You're smiling, but your chest is tight. That's the soul trying to send a message through the body. This kindness is killing us. And the more you ignore it, the louder the symptoms get. Exhaustion, anxiety, emotional numbness. Until one day, the person everyone loves is gone, and in their place is someone who doesn't even remember what they needed in the first place. There's a cost to being endlessly available. You lose your sharpness, your mystery, your power, and eventually, your self-respect. Not because others took it from you, but because you gave it away in exchange for peace that was never real. That's the bitter irony. You've built a life of emotional comfort for everyone around you, while slowly starving yourself. But here's what they don't expect, what even you forgot. You can stop. Not with rage, not with drama, but with stillness, with clarity, with one sacred word. Enough. Because every time you say yes when you mean no, a version of you dies a little. And maybe it's time to stop grieving the self you keep betraying and start protecting it instead. Let that be your new kindness. Fierce, sovereign, unapologetic. The kind that doesn't require pain to prove its value. The kind that honors both your heart and your edge. Though ChatGPT dice, imagine a kingdom with no gates, no guards, no watchtower. A place where anyone can enter, take what they want, stay as long as they please, and leave without consequence. At first, it might look generous, welcoming, open-hearted, noble. But over time, that kingdom starts to tremble. The walls weaken, the treasury is emptied. The people lose faith in its leadership. Because safety without structure is not kindness, it's negligence. And that kingdom is you. You were taught that being emotionally open meant never saying no. The true love has no walls, that acceptance means constant availability. So you left your gates wide open, hoping that by doing so, you'd be loved without question. But what happened instead was slow erosion. People entered your life with chaos, left behind their mess, and expected you to thank them for the connection. And you did, over and over, because you mistook openness for intimacy. You thought being accessible was the same as being loved. But Machiavelli would have seen the danger in that illusion immediately. He understood that every leader, no matter how just or merciful, must have control over who gains access. Not to dominate, but to preserve. Because a kingdom that cannot defend itself eventually becomes a ruin others walk through without reverence. The same is true for you. Your emotions are sacred territory. Your time, your energy, your vulnerability. They are currency, and when given without discernment, they lose their value. The people who truly respect you are not the ones who expect unlimited access. They are the ones who knock, who wait to be let in, who recognize that your boundaries are not rejection. They are proof that you value what's inside. But when you've lived most of your life without walls, building them feels violent. You second-guess yourself. You feel guilt. You wonder if they'll leave. And sometimes they do. But the ones who leave because you finally drew a line were never there for you. They were there for what you offered. Jung might say this is the moment the shadow steps forward, not to harm, but to protect. That inner voice you've silenced for years, the one that screams enough when someone crosses a line you never defined. That voice isn't anger, it's your guardian. The problem is you spent so long ignoring it in the name of love that now it roars. Not because it's cruel, but because it's been locked away behind years of self-sacrifice. Boundaries are not walls of isolation, they are gates of selection. They tell the world, I know what I'm worth, and I will not hand myself over for free. You are not being cold, you are remembering your worth. You are shifting from a life of emotional exposure to a life of intentional access. And that shift is terrifying, because it threatens the dynamic that once kept you safe. But what once kept you safe is now keeping you small, unprotected, eroded. You are the kingdom. Your emotions, the land. Your attention, the treasure. And your silence, the gates. Let them close. Let them creak and lock. Not to keep the world out, but to choose who deserves to come in. And watch, just watch, how the world starts to respond differently. Not because you became cruel, but because you finally became sovereign. You are the kingdom. That sounds poetic until you realize what it truly means. To rule, to defend, to discern who enters and who stays. But for most of your life, you've been a kingdom with open gates, no guards, no curfew, no criteria. Anyone could walk in, and they did. Some admire the view, others built fires that burned your walls. And you still called it love. You welcomed every broken story, every emotional wanderer, every demand disguised as affection. Because somewhere in your past, you learned that love meant making space. That being good meant being open. That having no gates meant you were safe from being the villain. You told yourself that your value came from being welcoming. And slowly, you lost the ability to say, not here, not like this. The world doesn't teach people like you how to guard themselves. It celebrates your availability, your softness, your ability to forgive before an apology even comes. But kindness without boundaries is not love. It's exposure. It's the act of laying yourself bare in the hope that someone will cherish what they did not earn. And most don't, not because they are cruel, but because they are human. And Machiavelli knew what human nature does with what it doesn't fear losing, it exploits it. He wrote that rulers who rely on the goodwill of others often find themselves betrayed. He wasn't saying to become cruel. He was saying to become conscious, because a territory with no defense invites conquest. And you been conquered, not with swords, but with silence, with passive demands, with a constant expectation that you'll always be available. And you were, even when it killed parts of you. Jung might say this is the price of suppressing the shadow, that fierce, protective part of you that knows how to say no, the one that can see through charm and guilt and emotional manipulation, but that you buried in favor of being liked. You feared your edge, so you gave it away. And in its place, you planted flowers no one watered but you. But flowers don't stop intruders. They don't protect your soul from being trampled. Gates do. Standards do. Distance does. And no, this isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming structured. Sacred things are not kept in the open. They're kept behind thresholds, not because they are shameful, but because they are rare. And you are rare. The first time you close your gates, they'll call you distant, dramatic, changed. But they don't know what it cost you to keep them open. They don't know the exhaustion of always being accessible. The way your body flinches when the phone rings. The way your soul sinks when someone says, "Can I just talk to you real quick?" As if your energy is endlessly renewable. As if your time doesn't bleed. You are not infinite. You are not a resource. You are a living, feeling being whose openness has become a form of quiet martyrdom. And it ends the moment you choose it. The moment you let the gates creak shut, not to lock out the world, but to remind yourself that not everyone deserves to enter. The kingdom isn't cruel for having doors. It's wise. So let them call you selfish. Let them leave. Let the silence settle like dusk over your inner landscape. Because what remains in the stillness are the few who knock gently, who wait to be let in, who see your worth not in your availability, but in your boundaries. And that's not just healing. That's power. Sovereign, sacred, yours. They say your smile lights up the room, but they never ask what it's hiding. You've been praised your whole life for being calm, gentle, easy to be around. The one who listens without interrupting, who stays long after everyone else has left. They call it grace. They call it kindness, but they never call it what it really is. Survival. You didn't become that person because it's who you are. You became that person because at some point, being liked was the only thing that kept you safe. It started when you were too young to name it. Maybe you were the child who made peace in a loud house. Maybe you were the partner who learned to tiptoe around moods like landmines. Maybe you were the friend who learned that being useful meant being loved. Either way, you became fluent in emotional labor, carrying the weight of other people's chaos while learning to smile through your own disintegration. And over time, that smile became permanent. Not because you're always happy, but because showing pain meant risking distance. And you couldn't afford to be left again. But what happens when that smile becomes your only armor? When even you start to believe that you're okay, simply because you've become so good at pretending? The truth is, that's not peace. It's repression. Jung warned that what we repress doesn't disappear. It waits. It hides in the shadows, feeding on our silence, growing in the dark corners of our soul. And eventually, it returns. Not as sadness, as numbness, as fatigue that no sleep can fix, as anxiety that no logic can calm. And here's the cruel irony. The more you smile, the less they see you. They see the version of you that makes their lives easier, more comfortable, more supported. And they love that version. But when you start to peel it back, when the cracks start to show, people look away. Because they weren't in love with your truth. They were in love with your role. And the moment you stop performing, the applause dies. Machiavelli wouldn't be surprised. He understood the performance of power. He saw that people rarely value what they take for granted. And in your case, your constant emotional generosity, your endless empathy became background noise, expected, automatic. And that's the most dangerous kind of invisibility, the one you build for yourself. in the hope that one day someone will see the real you behind the smile. But they won't. Not until you stop performing. The trauma behind your smile isn't weakness, it's intelligence. You adapted, you survived. But survival isn't living. And if you've reached the point where your silence feels louder than your voice, then this isn't about healing. This is about rebellion. Quiet, internal, sacred rebellion. The kind that begins not with confrontation, but with refusal. The refusal to keep pretending. The refusal to carry what was never yours. The refusal to keep smiling when your soul is begging for a pause. You don't have to explain the shift. You don't have to justify the boundaries. You don't have to apologize for no longer being the emotional sponge in everyone's life. All you have to do is stop. Step back. Breathe. Let the discomfort settle. Because the people who truly care won't punish your honesty. And the ones who do were never safe to begin with. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about removing the mask you were forced to wear. The real you isn't cold. The real you isn't selfish. The real you is tired of smiling to survive. And now, finally, the real you is ready to speak. Or maybe just sit in sacred silence. Not because you're shutting out the world, but because you're done abandoning yourself. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what he didn't say, what you've come to learn through exhaustion and quiet collapse, is that becoming yourself often begins in the rubble. It starts when the persona fractures, when the smile cracks, when the role you've played for everyone else becomes too heavy to wear. That's when the real self whispers from beneath the wreckage, "No more." And that whisper, though small, carries more truth than 1,000 conversations you've had while pretending to be okay. Machiavelli believed that power was not granted, it was taken. Not with force, but with clarity. The moment you stop asking for permission to be whole, you begin to reclaim everything you gave away just to feel safe. And make no mistake, you gave away a lot. Your voice, your boundaries, your needs. You traded them all for peace. But it wasn't peace. It was silence. Strategic silence that kept others comfortable and left you starving for recognition. But the truth is, no one can give you back what you've abandoned. Only you can decide it's time to stop bleeding for applause. There is something sacred about that decision. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like stillness. It looks like declining an invitation that drains you. Saying no without guilt. Letting go of a relationship that depends on your silence to survive. It's quiet, but it shakes the foundation of your entire emotional structure. Because the moment you stop betraying yourself for validation, the entire dynamic around you changes. Some will resist. Some will disappear. Let them. Their absence is not a loss. It's proof that your presence was never truly seen. And now, finally, you're seeing it for yourself. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of the shadow, the reunion with the abandoned self. It's not a spiritual aesthetic or a personal brand. It's war, not against the world, but against the lie that you ever had to become someone else to be loved. And when that lie dies, something ancient awakens. Your edge, your no, your fire. And with it, the ability to walk away from anything that asks you to shrink in order to belong. Machiavelli wouldn't have told you to be kind. He would have told you to be sovereign. And the difference is everything. Kindness without sovereignty is submission. But kindness rooted in self-respect becomes something else entirely. It becomes strength. The kind that doesn't beg. The kind that doesn't perform. The kind that knows love isn't real if it demands your disappearance. So here you are. Still bleeding in some places, still silent in others. But awake. And that awakening is irreversible. No more masks. No more leashes disguised as love. No more emotional discounts just to stay relevant. Because now you remember, you are not here to be easy. You are here to be whole. If this echoed something real in you, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. That's how this space survives, not through noise, but through truth. And let this image stay with you. You are the open hand that turned into a leash. It's time to let go or be dragged.